So today, we're diving into a story about one single, incredibly powerful idea that completely changed how the entire world thinks about money and wealth. And our story begins in a time when governments, kings, and empires had a totally different and, you could argue, a deeply wrong idea of what actually made a nation rich. It was a world just waiting for a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith to show up and basically change everything.
I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. What if your country's entire economic policy, all its rules about trade and taxes and business, was built on a fundamental mistake about what wealth even is? Well, that was pretty much the world Adam Smith was born into. For hundreds of years, one single economic idea had Europe in a death grip, and to question it wasn't just controversial, it was completely revolutionary.
All right, so to really get just how huge Smith's revolution was, we first have to understand the system he was fighting against. It was an economic worldview that was obsessed with one thing, and one thing only: shiny, heavy, precious metal.
Yeah, this system had a name: mercantilism. For centuries, the most powerful people on the planet were convinced that a nation's strength came directly from how much gold and silver it had piled up in the royal treasury. This idea wasn't just some dusty old theory, it was the actual operating manual for running a country. And the goal? It was brutally simple: get more gold than your rivals, no matter what it takes.
You see, the mercantilist way of thinking saw the world's wealth as one big fixed pie. If one country got a bigger slice, that meant another country had to get a smaller one. So trade wasn't about everybody winning. It was basically a form of economic war. And to win that war, you had to sell as much stuff as you could to bring gold in, and buy as little as possible to stop gold from flowing out. Their methods were all top-down and super controlling. Huge taxes on anything imported, giving special monopolies to companies with friends in high places, and using their giant colonial empires as a source for cheap stuff. The whole system was designed to make the state rich, but not necessarily the people living in it.
And then, into this whole world of state control and gold hoarding, walks Adam Smith. He takes one look at this incredibly complicated mercantilist system, and he doesn't see strength. He sees inefficiency, stagnation, and a huge fundamental mistake about what actually makes a nation wealthy.
The year is 1776. Now, that year should ring a bell. As American colonists are declaring their independence from a mercantilist empire, Great Britain, Smith publishes his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations. And believe me, it is absolutely no coincidence these two things happened at the same time. Both were born out of the same fire of the Enlightenment, this revolutionary way of thinking that was all about reason, individual freedom, and the hunt for the natural laws that secretly govern our world.
With this one, simple but totally devastating idea, Smith just flips centuries of economic thinking completely on its head. He basically said the mercantilist had it all backward. A nation's wealth isn't the pile of gold sitting in a king's vault. It's the amount of goods and services that its people can actually use and enjoy. This idea that the whole point of an economy is to serve the regular person, the consumer, was mind-blowingly radical back then.
And this was the fundamental shift, right? The old world saw wealth as this static pile of gold, controlled by the government for the glory of the king. Smith's new vision saw wealth as something dynamic, the stuff a nation produces every year, guided by natural laws and for the benefit of everybody. He wasn't just suggesting a few small changes. He was calling for a complete overhaul of the entire system. Okay, so if the heavy, controlling hand of the state isn't running the show anymore, then what is? Well, Smith's answer was one of the most brilliant and famous metaphors in the history of ideas.
Smith argued that something amazing happens in a free market. When people just act in their own self-interest, they often end up promoting the good of the whole society, almost like they're being guided by an invisible hand. His famous line is, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." The baker doesn't make bread because he loves you, he bakes it to make a living. But, and here's the magic, to succeed, he has to make good bread at a price you're willing to pay. And so, individual ambition, when it's channeled by competition, ends up serving everyone.
And what was the engine driving all of this new prosperity? Smith pointed to something right at the beginning of his book: the division of labor. His example of a pin factory is just legendary. He noticed that one worker trying to do every single step by himself could barely make one clumsy pin in a day. But a small team of 10, where each person specializes in just one or two simple steps, they could produce an incredible 48,000 pins a day. That massive leap in productivity, all from specialization, that was the true source of a nation's wealth.
Now, don't get the wrong idea. Smith wasn't arguing for no government at all. He saw a really important but limited role for what we sometimes call a night watchman state. The government's job wasn't to run the economy, but to set up the basic foundation for it. First, you need national defense to protect from invaders. Second, a justice system to protect private property and make sure people honor their contracts. That's the bedrock of a market. And third, to provide essential public goods like roads, bridges, and even some basic education, stuff that helps everyone but that a private company might not want to build.
So Smith's classical model was, incredibly powerful and became the main way of thinking for over a century and led to just unprecedented economic growth. But it wasn't perfect. As industrial capitalism exploded, new and really troubling problems started to pop up. Problems with inequality, instability, and crises that the classical model had a hard time explaining. And this opened the door for some powerful new critiques. This became the big, nagging question, right? What happens when the markets don't fix themselves as neatly as the theory says they should? What if the pursuit of self-interest doesn't lead to a happy society, but instead leads to financial panics, deep inequality, and millions of people out of work? The classical idea of a smooth, self-regulating system was about to face its toughest tests. Let's look at unemployment, for example, because it really exposed the cracks. Smith's followers usually saw it as a temporary problem, maybe because unions or something were keeping wages stuck too high. But two absolute giants of economic thought had much more radical ideas. Karl Marx saw unemployment not as a bug in the system, but as a feature, a reserve army of labor that capitalism needed to keep wages low and profits high. Then, decades later, John Maynard Keynes came along and said, no, entire economies can just get stuck in a rut, not because of high wages, but because of a simple, crippling lack of spending.
Karl Marx, he was kind of like Smith's dark reflection. He took Smith's own ideas, especially that labor is the source of all value, and he turned them into this devastating critique. Marx asked a pretty simple question. If labor creates all the value, why do the laborers only get a tiny piece of that value back as wages? He called this gap surplus value, and he argued it was the exact measure of how capitalism exploits people. For Marx, the market wasn't a place of harmony, it was a battlefield between the owners and the workers.
But the biggest real-world punch to classical theory came in the 1930s with the Great Depression. The global nightmare of millions of people, able and willing to work, being unemployed for years. It just seemed to shatter the idea that markets always fix themselves. This huge crisis created an opening for John Maynard Keynes. He argued that in a really bad downturn, the invisible hand is basically paralyzed. The only way out, he said, was for the government to step in and start spending money to boost demand and shock the economy back to life. A complete and total rejection of the classical leave-it-alone philosophy.
So after all these powerful critiques, is classical economics just, a history lesson, something we study in school and that's it? Not even close. The core ideas that Adam Smith came up with have proven to be incredibly tough, and they continue to shape our world in really profound and often controversial ways.
You can actually trace the long arc of this idea through history. Smith's ideas didn't just stay in books, they grew. Economists like David Ricardo used them to build the powerful case for free trade. After World War II, they became the actual blueprint for global policy, built right into institutions like the GATT and later the World Trade Organization. In the 1980s, they inspired a political revolution of deregulation and privatization. And today, this 250-year-old framework is still right at the center of our biggest economic fights.
And this right here is the key takeaway. Today's massive debate over free trade versus protectionism, it's the exact same intellectual battle that Adam Smith was fighting 2.5 centuries ago, just with modern clothes on. The arguments for open markets and global supply chains? Pure classical Smith. And the arguments for protecting local jobs and using tariffs as a weapon? Those are echoes of the exact same mercantilist ideas he was trying to defeat. This isn't just history, it's the central fight in our global economy, right now.
So yeah, the great intellectual battle that kicked off back in 1776, it never really stopped. It plays out every single day in the news, in our elections, and in how countries deal with each other. Adam Smith gave us the basic language for free markets, but the question of how to balance the freedom he championed with the fairness and stability his critics demanded, well, that remains the defining economic challenge of our time.